My guest is Nir Cohen. He's associated with the Rubin Academic Center in Israel. Nir, I want to talk to you about the diaspora Jews. You've been a diaspora Jew for a bit, so you had a bit of flavor, but you went abroad for your education. Why did you go back? A lot of Israelis don't go back.
Well, Howard, you know, it's funny. I just had a conversation with a couple of Israelis who have been living in Toronto for a few years now, and that's one of the questions that came up. And I said, you know, going back to Israel in many instances for Israelis is not a rational choice. It's something that you do with your heart. It's something that, you know, you do less with your mind. I mean, you're aware of the difficulties, you're aware of the situation in the labor market, you're aware of how difficult it is to get an academic position, yet you do it, you know, for the future of your kid. I mean, there's, you know, a whole bunch of reasons. Mostly have to do with the second generation, I would say. So that would be the short answer.
But you've been studying the diaspora Jewry and diaspora Israelis, right? And do you find patterns among them? Because you have a small migration of diaspora Jews, especially from North America to Israel, but it's relatively small. Partly it's the inhibition of economic adjustments and language adjustments and all that. And there's a different culture in Israel. I mean, you know, especially Canadians, you know. Israelis are a rough culture compared to the quiet, placid Canadian atmosphere.
That's true, and that's probably what explains the fact that I think the return rate amongst North American Jews who've made Aliyah is over 40%. So 40% of North American Jews who've made Aliyah eventually returned to the United States and Canada and basically their countries of origin. So these are fairly high numbers, and I think you're right that one of the major reasons are the cultural differences between Israel and those countries. Now, in terms of Israelis, it's slightly different, I think, because in many cases what prompts Israelis to leave the country is obviously, you know, the economic situation, the lack of opportunities for many of them. So I think in that sense it's a little different. What we're seeing more and more, and this is part of the research that I'm engaged with right now, what we're seeing more and more is actually, whereas in the past Israelis, you know, not only obviously not single-handedly, but they sort of separated themselves, both spatially in space and socially, from the Jewish communities in the U.S. and Canada. I think we're seeing a sort of a process of rapprochement over the last perhaps decade or so.
That's right, it's just begun. Partly it's the non-recognition of the Jewish community.
That's right. That's right.
Part of it, in my own work, and part of it is this ideology that you really belong in Israel, where you're sort of a bit of a traitor.
That's right.
We're guilty for not going there, but you're even more guilty by deserting. So you have these complex emotions going on. But I think the major change that's leading to is a recognition that Jews are going to live all over the world no matter what the ideology is.
I think you're absolutely right, but at the same time I think, and this is again something that I wrote about, is the role of the Israeli state, because this is the third factor that I would add to that. Even though Israelis for many years said, well, we don't need really the legitimacy of the state, you know, it doesn't determine for us where to live. I think many of them were affected by the stigmas. And I think what we're seeing, I would say since the very late 80s, early 90s, is what I call in one of my papers almost an enthusiastic embracement of Israelis abroad. Now this is, of course, you have to be sort of a little suspicious about what motivates this embracement. You know, and sometimes in Hebrew we call it chibuk dov. You know, it's the kind of hug that you don't always, that you sometimes want to get away from. But seriously, I think what motivated the Israeli government is the understanding that the vast majority of Israeli immigrants are not going to return to Israel. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they are becoming a sort of a subset of the Jewish diaspora. And frankly, they're very fervent, they're very supportive. They want, you know, they want their kids to, they want Israel to be part of their and their kids' lives. And so at some point there was this, I think, a change of heart in a sense in Israel. And people in the Ministry of Immigrant Absorption, people in the Foreign Affairs Ministries realized, hey, these people are not a burden. They are an asset. They are a very active cultural diaspora that if we know how to deal with, they're going to be very, very helpful in all kinds of issues, both foreign and domestic.
But when they recognize they're a significant cultural diaspora associated and identified with Israel, they haven't gone to the length of fostering Israeli-centered schools in the diaspora. And so you have that tension between the Jewish schools, which are, after all, Jews in the diaspora who stay affiliated largely do so through synagogues. Mm-hmm. Israelis abroad are overwhelmingly, my impression, is secular. And so you don't have the cultural center to hold them together. I don't think the synagogues have been that successful in reaching out to them. They may have been, but I don't have that impression. So there's a dynamic going on there that leaves lots of rooms for opening, but don't seem to be taken advantage of.
I think you're right about membership in Jewish congregations, at least in the past, and perhaps up to the present. Israelis have refrained from doing that for the reasons we all know. It's too diasporic for them. On the one hand, on the other hand, I think joining a synagogue would be like a final mark that we're here for good. But I think it's starting to change a little bit, especially amongst the more highly educated Israeli immigrants. I think they realize, again, like we said before, that the stigma is over, and it's okay to reconnect, in a sense, with your Jewish identity. So at least in Tucson, where I spent about a little over 4 years in the mid-2000s, a fairly large share of the Israeli population was affiliated in one way or another with formal Jewish institutions like the Jewish Community Center, sent their kids to all kinds of Jewish extracurricular activities, synagogues as well, congregations. Now granted, not every week and perhaps maybe not every month, but trying to foster that kind of a Jewish identity. And I think this is also a reflection of what's going on in Israel. Israeli Jews, we're seeing more and more sort of return or it's a very confusing era in Israel as well. So on the one hand, you have this very strong globalizing trends. On the other hand, people are searching for their roots. And I think Israelis abroad are in that sense emulating Israeli Jews in Israel and trying to reconnect with some of their sort of Jewishness. And
with that, we're going to have to end. I want to thank you, Nir. I really appreciate your coming.
Thank you.
We visited Jaffa when we were in Israel. Next week, the magnificent Mayumana group from Tel Aviv offers a mixture of beat, movement, and humor in the sheer joy of human creativity. We also have our own homegrown talent. They're not of the stompin' rompin' kind, but bring the sweet sounds of the human voice. Join us next week for a pulsating and entertaining evening.